Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
For those of you who were not on our campus yesterday for the first of our series, this is the Nathan Maier Memorial Series in Bible Exposition. And our speaker this week is Dr. David Ashcraft. David was born in Dallas and raised in France until the age of 7. His family moved to California and then back to Dallas for his middle and high school years. He's a graduate of Texas Tech University with a degree in business administration. He holds the Master of Theology degree here at Dallas Seminary and the Doctor of Ministry degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School near Chicago. For 12 years, he served at the Scofield Memorial Church in Dallas as minister to adults, and 10 years as the director of Scofield's Camp Elhar, also located in Dallas. He began serving at his present location in 1991. The church is known as the Lives Changed by Christ Church in Lancaster County in Manheim, Pennsylvania. For 20 years, over the last 20 years, the church has grown from a weekly attendance of 150 people and a staff of 1 to a weekly attendance of 10,500 people and a staff of over 100. God has uniquely moved in that region, and David comes to us. He's married to his wife Ruth. They have 2 children. Justin is a recent grad of Lancaster Bible College, and Ashley is currently serving with YWAM Youth Ministries. And Ruth is here. We had her stand yesterday. Ruth, are you here again today? Would you stand and let them greet you again? Thank you. And as I mentioned yesterday, some of you will recognize the Ashcraft name. His father, Neil Ashcraft, served for many, many years as the pastor of the Scofield Church here in Dallas before retiring to do other ministries in his retirement years. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. David Ashcraft back to our platform this morning?
And I'm very glad that Ruth, my wife, decided to come back today, so that was encouraging to have her here. Well, in the late 16th century, Pope Gregory the Great put together a list of sins that he considered to be destructive to our relationships. He said they were destructive in our relationships with each other, but he also said they were destructive to our relationship with God. And Pope Gregory called these sins the 7 deadly sins because they, in his mind, were so destructive. And the interesting thing about his list of 7 deadly sins is that all of them tend to be inside of each and every one of us. All of them tend to lurk inside of us, whether we know it or not. And we know that everybody else struggles with these 7 deadly sins, but none of us typically want to admit that they happen to be in us as well. And they're in us, and they damage our relationships with each other, and they tend to damage our relationship with God. And so today I want us to look at the number 1 sin that Gregory said as far as this list of 7 deadly sins. And I would suggest that not only is this particular sin kind of on his list, not only does it hinder people in their relationship with each other, but it hinders our relationship with God, and it tends to be probably the one that I see destroying more pastors or more leaders or church leaders than in any of the other sins on his list, or really more than any other sin maybe that's there. And before I tell you what the number 1 sin on his list was, let me tell you something interesting about all 7 of these issues. I mean, the truth is that probably all 7 are active and present in your life right now. And you may not understand it, you may not see it, you may not know it, but I can tell you your friends know it. Your family knows it. The other people around you know it. Now, they'll never tell you that they see one of these 7 things active in your life, because if they told you, you probably wouldn't listen anyway. But they're there and they're active. And interesting thing is, the people that dislike you, your enemies, your critics, they will be more than happy to tell you that they see these in your life, or tell anybody else that they see them. But your friends typically don't tell you these things. And as much as we hate to admit it, they're there, they're active inside of us. And from time to time, when we get bumped, when we kind of, certain things happen in our lives, these sins tend to come out, usually at the most inopportune of times. And let me illustrate it to you kind of this way, what these 7 deadly sins look like. And I want to illustrate it by introducing you to a couple of folks that actually I was first introduced to by Andy Stanley, another Dallas Seminary grad who happens to live in the Atlanta area. But this is Mr. and Mrs. Mugg. And actually, How are we doing, Mr. and Mrs. Mugg? I think they're doing well. And we'll actually say this is Pastor Mugg, and this is his wife, Mrs. Mugg. And Mr. and Mrs. Mugg met really at the end of their college career. And she saw him, and she was excited. He was about to graduate with a degree, and so she was excited about that. He was going to go on to seminary, and he looked at her, and just look at her. He just fell for her immediately. And so Pastor and Mrs. Mugg, or at least that time he was Mr. Mugg, they were very careful with each other as they began their relationship. They didn't want to do anything to upset each other. They wanted to make sure they had the best impression with one another. A few little bumps in their relationship as they kind of began to progress. But then they got married. And about a month into their relationship, a month into their marriage, something happened, and they had a big bump, and just stuff came out. And they kind of looked at each other and thought, where did all of that come from? And they went on and just kind of decided it just must have been kind of a one-time thing. And they went on, and then they hit another big bump, and more stuff came out. And so she talked to her sister. And she said, you will not believe what happened and what's inside of this guy. I didn't know it when we got married. And he went off to talk to, and we don't know who men go off and talk to. He went off and he kind of looked in the mirror and he thought to himself, and he thought, I've never seen that in her before, and I don't know what's going on here, but every time she just rubs me the wrong way, and these things happen and we bump and all this stuff comes out, and they were frustrated with each other. They'd never seen that before. It wasn't that way when they were dating. And what's interesting is Mr. Mugg thinks that the blue beads come out of him because of her. It's her fault. If she would quit bumping him, if they wouldn't have conflicts, it wouldn't happen. And she looks at him and says, well, if it wasn't for you, you're the one that causes this to happen in me. And what's interesting and what they don't realize is the reason blue beads come out of Mr. Mugg or Pastor Mugg is because that's what's inside of him. And the reason pink beads come out of Mrs. Mugg is that's what's inside of her. And every time there's a conflict, what's inside just comes out. And tends to happen, usually in our closest relationships, tends to happen to people we're closest to. And so oftentimes in a romantic relationship it comes out, or if it's your roommate or if it's family or whatever, the people closest to us tend to cause these things to come out of us. And Pastor Mugg and Mrs. Mugg, they served in a church and they felt like things were going well, but sometimes the beads would come out even in their setting at church. One Sunday, Pastor Mugg was standing in the back greeting people, and Mrs. Jones came out and she said, you know what, that song we sang today, that's not the kind of song you sing in church. It sounds more like something you'd hear in a nightclub. And just beads came out. I thought, whoa, where did that come from? And then Mr. Martin came and he said, you know what, you've got to fix the high school group because my kids, they don't like it. If you don't fix it, we're leaving. And then more beads came out, and they just keep coming out. And it's not so much because of the conflict, it's just what's inside of us that tends those things to come out. And so what I'd like to talk about today, excuse me for the beads here. What I'd like to talk about today is just what may be just kind of the number one thing that tends to come out of each and every one of us. And here's what's at the top of Pope Gregory's 7 deadly sins. And he says the number one thing as far as the 7 deadly sins is the issue of pride. And he says all of us kind of have pride in our lives, and it tends to cause a big mess in our relationships with each other and in our relationships with God. And when we get bumped, pride tends to come out, and it gets real messy. Don Shula was a legendary former coach of the Miami Dolphins, and he tells about being on vacation one time with his wife. He said they were actually in the state of Maine, and they walked into a movie theater, and he said there were just a handful of people in this movie theater, small town in Maine, and when they walked in, all the people that were there, and again, it was just a handful, just a few of them were there, but they all applauded. And Shula said, I was very pleased with myself, and he thought, man, I'm even famous here in Maine. And he even nudged his wife, and he said, I guess there's no place that we can go that we're not known. And so just before the movie actually started, a guy came over and shook Coach Shula's hand, and Shula said to the man, I'm surprised that you folks know me here in Maine. And the guy's response was, know you? Am I supposed to know you? He said, the manager of the movie theater, he said, he's not going to start the movie until 10 people come in. You were 9 and 10, and we're glad you're here. And a simple definition of pride is just kind of this excessive belief in one's own abilities. It's just kind of thinking too highly of ourselves. It's always wanting to be better than you. where I just want to be better than you. And not a lot of us can tolerate a pride-filled person for very long, and they kind of grate on us. They repel us. And what we learn from the Bible is God actually feels the same way about people that are filled with pride, but he actually maybe even feels worse about it than we do. And so let me give you, if you were to go to the book of Proverbs and just look at pride, let me just run through a couple of verses for you. I think they're going to be on the screen behind me. But Proverbs 11, chapter 11, verse 2 says, "Pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." Or Proverbs 12:10 says, "Pride leads to conflict. Those who take advice are wise." And Proverbs 16:5 says, "The Lord detests the proud. They will surely be punished." And Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goes before destruction, haughtiness before a fall." And Proverbs 16:19, "Better to live humbly with the poor than to share plunder with the proud." And Proverbs 29:23 says, "Pride ends in humiliation. With humility brings honor." And if we were to jump to the book of James, James 4:6 says, "God opposes the proud, but favors the humble." God opposes the proud. He sets himself against the proud. And I can think of a lot of forces in the world that I wouldn't really want opposing me. And I wouldn't want Chris Jericho or CM Punk opposing me in a wrestling ring, or I wouldn't want Bill Gates opposing me in an auction, or I wouldn't want DeMarcus Ware opposing me on the football field, or I wouldn't want LeBron James opposing me on the basketball court, or at least not for the first three quarters. Fourth quarter might be a little bit different, but we kind of see on that. But even more so, I would not want the God of the universe to stand in opposition to me. With his arms crossed and saying, "I will oppose your plans," I would not want the Almighty God standing in my path and just being in opposition to me. But that's what God says he does to those who are arrogant and those who are prideful. I mean, you think about it. What would it be like for the sovereign God of the universe to stand with his arms crossed in front of you and just kind of opposing you? It says, whatever plans you have, I'm not in opposition to them. Whatever dreams you have for the future, I'm opposed to those dreams and those plans. And whatever path you're walking on, I'm going to oppose it because of your arrogance. And theologian Martin Luther actually called pride the deepest of all human vices. And another writer actually said, if you search the Bible for the one sin that most incites the wrath of God, he said it's just pride. And he said the one sin that moves God to corrective action almost every single time it appears is just the sin of arrogance. And in others, God says, I can't stand it. Psalm 138:6 says, though the Lord is great, he cares for the humble, but he keeps his distance from the proud. And you contrast that to what God says about his attitude towards the humble. James 4:6 says, God favors the humble. In other words, he pours his favor out on the humble. He surprises them with blessings. He smooths their path. He lightens their loads and kind of opens doors for them. And God gives grace to the humble. But he says, the proud, I'm going to oppose, and I'm going to keep my distance from them. And James 4:10 says, God will exalt the humble. In other words, what God is going to do is he's going to find creative ways to give honor and bring respect to those that are truly humble. And one way or another, in this life or in the next, maybe a little bit in both, God is going to honor, he's going to bless those that he says are truly humble. And what's interesting is, in our world, the world that we live in, we kind of just, pride is more just an irritation. It just kind of, it bugs us. It's irritating to be around people that are prideful. But the Bible says God detests it. He opposes it. He's not going to endure it. He's going to pay it back in full. And I believe God talks that way about the issue of pride because it's so lethal in our relationships with one another, and it's lethal in our relationship with him. And the Bible actually tells numerous stories about people thinking too highly of themselves. And one such person is a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was a king who thought very highly of himself. And let me ask you to open up your Bibles. Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. And let me just read to you a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar and just kind of what's going on in his life. And it's a story you're familiar with. Nebuchadnezzar, his situation, Daniel chapter 3. Let me begin in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 3. And again, you know this story. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messengers to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue that he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And if anybody had reason to be proud, it probably would be Nebuchadnezzar, because as king of Babylon, he had conquered the known world. He had built amazing cities and palaces. He had gone to war. He had conquered the opposition. Now he's just living the good life. And he's really just doing what all of us want to do. We just want to get to a point where we can just enjoy life and just live the good life. I mean, isn't that what a lot of us are just striving for? And to sit back and enjoy the fruits of our labor. And so Nebuchadnezzar is doing that. And one day, he's actually walking around just surveying the city that he's in and all that he owns. And go to chapter 4 of Daniel, verse 29. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar says as he just surveys the land around him and all that he's accomplished. So 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. And as he looked out across the city, he said, "Look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor." And in essence, what he's saying is, look at all that I've accomplished. And I've accomplished all of this on my own, and I don't need anybody, and I don't need anything else. And there's a lot that he has achieved. It's an amazing city, but in his statements, there's no acknowledgement of dependence on God. And in his statement, there's no sense that every breath that he takes and every thought that he thinks is actually a gift from God. And there's no sense at all that he's accountable to the God who really allowed him to build this great city and this great empire. And so again, you look at his words, and he says, "Look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city. My residence is on display. My majesty is on display." And Pope Gregory the Great actually wrote, he said, "Pride makes me think that I'm the cause of my achievements. It makes me think that I'm the cause and that I deserve my abilities, and it leads me to despise people that don't measure up." I think it just damages relationships. I mean, it tends to cause this illusion of self-sufficiency, that I've made myself, that I deserve everything that I have. Actually, I recently heard a story about a man who was just very proud. He was the CEO of a huge corporation. One day, he and his wife were driving. They pulled into a gas station, and when he comes out of the gas station, he notices his wife in a very animated conversation with the gas station attendant. And so as they get in the car and they drive away, they start to talk, and he finds out that she and this gas station attendant had dated each other when they were in high school. And so this CEO, as he's driving away, he's feeling very cocky at that moment, thinking he's the CEO, the other guy's a gas station attendant. And so there was a time of silence in the car as they're riding, and then he finally says to his wife, "I'll bet I know what you're thinking." "What's you're thinking?" He says, "I'll bet is you're pretty lucky that you married me, the CEO of this great corporation, not that gas station attendant." And so she paused, and there was silence for a while. And she said, "No, actually, I was thinking that if I had married him and not you, he would be the CEO of a great organization. You would be a gas station attendant." And there's just kind of this illusion that I've done it. I've made myself in who I am. And do you ever find yourself motivated to kind of seek power, or motivated to seek recognition or seek influence, or just kind of praise for your own sake? And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar was struggling with. He had a problem with pride. Thing is, he didn't even know it. And what's interesting about pride is it's one of those things where it's there, and usually the people that have it are the ones that are least likely to know that it's there. And so God's going to have to act, and he's going to have to take action, because this pride has become too deeply woven into Nebuchadnezzar's way of just seeing things and living. And his agenda, his priorities are really all that he can think about. God's not a part of it. So God's going to have to interrupt his life. And God launches Nebuchadnezzar on a journey that's going to be very long, and it's going to be very painful. And God launches Nebuchadnezzar in a way, and it becomes a battle, really, for his soul. He's been in a lot of other battles before, but this is a battle for his soul and his relationship with God. And so here's what happens. Look at verse 31 of chapter 4, Daniel chapter 4, verse 31. It says, "While these words," and the words were, I'm great, I'm the one that's built all of these things. "While these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, 'O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You're no longer the ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you'll eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone that he chooses. That same hour, the judgment was fulfilled, and Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven. He lived this way until his hair was as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. And again, you've got to understand this. God says he is going to oppose the proud. He's going to be set against those that are prideful. And what we need to understand is God is every bit as capable today as he was several thousand years ago of shutting down anyone. Any little kingdom, any life, any career, any church, any organization that gets so caught up in its own little achievements that it violates the humility of God. God is every bit as capable of doing that for you or me today than he was several thousand years ago. And I think the reason God opposes pride so deeply isn't that he's threatened by high achievers. And the reason that God opposes pride so deeply is not because he's obsessed with getting credit for anything. As a matter of fact, the greatest expression of humility of all was probably God in the flesh, Jesus coming to earth to live and live among us and die in order to take care of our sins and just the junk and issues. And he did this out of his great love for us. And what's interesting is it's pride that probably keeps most people from turning to Jesus and following him, because it's pride that says, I know better. I don't need any help. I don't need you, God. And Jesus says that God is available to all who are humble enough to just admit that they need help in dealing with their sin and the issues of their lives. And pride is a huge danger for every one of us, and probably the number one issue for all of us. And if we allow pride to roam free in our lives, then God is going to have to act. And God's going to have to take action when pride gets woven too deeply in the way that we live and the way that we see life and the way that we think. And so let me just kind of get personal with this for a moment, if I can, with you. And because again, the problem is, it's always easier to see pride in somebody else than it is in ourselves. And it bothers us when we see it in other people. And it bothers us, but the truth is, one way or another, every one of us in this room, we struggle with the issue of pride. And so if you've been thinking, as I've been talking, about somebody else that you wish was listening to this, then quit thinking about them and let's think about ourselves. And let me just kind of run through, especially areas that I tend to see pride kind of playing out in church leaders. And when it comes to church leaders, so often it comes out in the form of stubbornness. Stubbornness and maybe an unwillingness to listen to the thoughts or opinions of anybody else. I mean, why should we listen to anybody else? We've got training and education. We've got a seminary degree. What do they know about what God says in the Bible? Or we see it, in church leaders oftentimes with just an unwillingness to just listen to anybody else and constantly defending ourselves. And not listening when somebody else sees a flaw or a blemish in our lives, not being willing to admit that we could possibly be wrong. And it's just pride. And this is huge for pastors because, again, we think we've got the training, we've got the education, we know the Bible. Who are they to tell us what really is going on? And yet, man, it's there in each and every one of us. And could there be maybe another valid view on the issue? Could there be another way to interpret that situation? And another form that pride tends to come out is just when we try to always be in control and to control everything else, a real controlling person. And God says instead of trying to control and just kind of get to the top of the ladder, we ought to be submitting to one another. But controlling people have a real hard time submitting to somebody else. And if you're a controlling person, your motto is kind of, if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself because nobody else can be trusted like I can. And we've got a difficult time handing the reins over to somebody else. And when LCBC, our church, had grown from about 150 people to about 600 people, we began to realize that there were things going on in the church that as leaders we knew nothing about what all was going on in the church. And they were good things that were going on, but I can remember one particular elder being very upset about the fact that there were things going on in the church, very good things, but things going on in the church that he didn't know about. And he said people would come and ask him about those things. And he said, as an elder, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know how to answer those. And he said that was embarrassing to me. And so he said, we as elders, we've got to know everything that's going on in our church. And he felt that we just needed to get control of what was going on, is what he continually said. He said, how can we not know if we're really the leaders? But as we discussed, as we prayed the matter, we really came to the conclusion our job as leaders was not to control what was going on in the church, but our job instead was to equip people and then to release them to serve in ways that we've never even thought about, we never even dreamed about before. And since that time, it's been an incredible journey where we just equip and release and we don't try to control. And God's taken us on this amazing, incredible journey. And that particular elder is no longer with us. He wanted to control. And one other form of pride that I'll just kind of mention to you, and I think it's our propensity to judge other people. Always wanting to judge other people. And if this is you, then the world is kind of like a movie, and you've been assigned to be the critic of that movie. And maybe one of your favorite phrases is, it may not be any of my business, but, and then you go on to make it your business. And you begin to evaluate, and you take pleasure, oftentimes in the failure of others. Or I see it in religious leaders, and I think sometimes religious leaders are the worst at this, where we see another church in town that's growing faster than ours, and we just assume, well, they've got to be doing something wrong. I mean, they couldn't be doing that well if they're not doing something wrong. Surely they've watered down the gospel. Or we see another church that's doing better than ours, and we assume they have to have sold out. They can't be teaching the Bible anymore. Surely they've got to be just kind of entertaining people with technology or just gimmicks. Or we see another church that maybe holds a different view than us on doctrinal issues or theology, and we criticize them in the name of doctrinal purity. And can I just tell you, it breaks my heart when I see church leaders just lash out at one another, just judging and criticizing because one person chooses to do things differently than another person. And so can I just suggest to you, the next time you're tempted to write a blog and criticize somebody else, then the next time you find yourself getting wound up and wanting to criticize others, do us all a favor and just slow down. Slow down before you write your book. Slow down before you make your public statements. At least take the time to make sure your criticisms are correct. At least take the time to make sure that what you're saying is true and that it's going to make a difference for eternity. And judging other people, it's one of the ways that pride tends to show itself. And so how do we deal with the issue of pride? Let me just suggest a couple things very quickly in dealing with our pride. And the first thing is just to acknowledge it, to just go ahead and acknowledge the fact that it's there. And definitely you want to acknowledge it to God and say, God, this is an issue. Sometimes I'm blind to it. Sometimes I don't see it, but it's there and it's real. And maybe you want to acknowledge it to another person that can hold you accountable. And then as you acknowledge it, then God says, just begin to humble yourself. And sometimes we think it's humbling ourselves as trying to convince ourselves that we're unattractive or that we're incompetent people. And we get confused about this, but it's not about beating yourself up. I mean, it's not about trying to make yourself into nothing. If God wanted to make you nothing, he could do that. And so it's not about you trying to make yourself nothing, but maybe it's getting to the point of saying, it's not about me, it's about others first. And putting others first, and stop being so preoccupied with yourself. And so acknowledge the fact that pride is there. Stop being so preoccupied with yourself. And then just one more real simple suggestion. As you go through life, do good things, but learn to do them in secret. Do good things and do them in secret. Don't give in to the temptation that everybody around you has to see the good things that you're doing. And don't give in to the temptation that you've got to somehow impress everybody else. And if you can begin to practice doing good things, but doing them in secret, and get to the point where you could be freed from this feeling that somehow everybody else has to notice you, somehow everybody else has to be impressed with you, and you live your life without having to impress others. And just do good things, but do them in private. And bottom line, probably the challenge is when you're tempted to try to draw attention to yourself, then instead of doing that, learn to just kind of repeat this phrase: here's my chance to be quiet. Here's my chance to be quiet. I don't have to draw attention to myself. And so I would just kind of encourage you and challenge you today. This is your opportunity to be free from the sheer stupidity, the painfulness, the vanity of going through life trying to make sure everybody else notices you. To be free from the fact that, don't wait for God to come to the point where he says, okay, I'm done. Now I will oppose you. Your dreams for the future, your goals, your plans for your life, for your ministry, for the people that you're leading. Don't wait for the time when God just stands in opposition to you and says, I will oppose you. I will distance myself from you. And why allow something like pride to just kind of run free in your life when the only thing that it's going to do is pull you away from God, and it's going to pull you away from others? And so today I would just challenge you, acknowledge your pride, humble yourself, look for opportunities to do good, but do it in private, and just be quiet. And in the months and in the days and years ahead, as you can continue to serve God, I hope for you, as you lead for him, In your life and in your church or whatever organization you're leading in, I hope for you that God is for you, not against you. That God does not stand in opposition and say, because of your arrogance, because of your pride, I'm setting myself against you.